Okay, I think it's now recording, Trey. So welcome and many thanks for this opportunity to interview you. It's really good. I mean, we meet we've been meeting at meetings and Zoom meetings over recent months, and we haven't had a chance to have a chat really about things. So I welcome the opportunity to have this conversation with you. So you kick off, if you like. You describe yourself as a multiracial writer, an activist and a speaker, and you often use key words to describe the things that you're interested in poetry, education, mental health, race and Black history. So perhaps you'd like to say a little bit more about what you mean by say being a multiracial writer and an activist and a speaker to start with. What do you mean by those terms?
Multiracial is, I think, a more politically correct term for mixed race. Historically speaking, someone who has got literally a multiracial background, because it was only I grew up thinking that I was monoracially a Black person, and then found out that my dad's actually mixed race, and I just didn't know. I just assumed that he was monoracially Black, because his mum, my grandmother, is mixed race Jamaican, because her mum was mixed race, but her father, so my great grandmother's father, was a white man from Ireland.
We all originate from Ireland. So the Irish will say we all come from Ireland. So congratulations.
So yeah, mixed race for me, that's my family tree, probably going back 150 years, possibly 100 to 150 years within that, and I'm looking to explore that a bit more within that.
So this notion of being multiracial for you is really important to explore. That it's your identity is a complex one, not something that you can neatly put into a box and label it Black or white or whatever it may be. Clearly not white. You know what I mean? It's a more complex thing, which you want to explore through your writing.
Yeah, and when you look at the history of those islands, the Caribbean as well, that it's not just Black people that live there. You had Indians going to those islands after the end of enslavement, I think around 1838, and it's right at the end, essentially. And then you also had Chinese people going there. You had Lebanese people going there, and you had Jews as well there. And obviously you had the Europeans there as well. And also you've got white Creole people there. And today those islands are diverse and they're mixed. But when we discuss the history, when we discuss the Caribbean, I think a lot of people think of it as a monoracially Black place, not knowing that it is a diverse. There's a diversity there that's not really talked about by people who don't live there, who live outside of the Caribbean. If you live there, you know, or if you've got. But from a European perspective, I think it's still seen as a very monoracially Black place to go. Same with the African continent as well, and it's the most ethnically diverse place on earth. So I think, by saying multiracial, that's what I'm hinting at, and I can trace that on my family tree as well.
Yeah, so I mean, and I know that your interest in Black history. We know that there's been Black settlement in Britain for at least 2,000 years, if not before. So this notion that, in a sense, all societies, recent societies, are multiracial, but we often assume a monoracial composition, or historically. But I mean, there's Black soldiers in the UK from the Roman times. Right through to more recent times. And I know, so you'd like to say something about your interest in Black history and how that's come about?
I think I've always been interested in Black history, ever since I was a young child. And I think my introduction to that was Walter Tull. When I was a kid, my mum made me do a project on Walter Tull, just to see what I could find out about him, essentially. I was about 7 years old, 8 years old when I did that, and it's not been the same since, essentially.
Could you say, some people may not know who Walter Tull is, perhaps say a little bit about Walter Tull?
Walter Tull was a mixed race footballer who played for Northampton Cobblers at the start of the 20th century. He also played for Tottenham and Clapton Orient, I believe, as well. And he was also the first mixed race army officer in the British Army during the First World War, and broke the colour bar in the process as well of doing that. So that's why I think that's why people remember him.
I mean, he died a hero, didn't he? Because he died in the First World War.
Yeah.
He was killed in the trenches, and so he became a bit of a local hero. For that. Yeah.
But I think the story of Walter Tull, it speaks a lot to institutional racism in the army. That's still a problem today. And even within that story of Walter Tull, you've got history there of not just sports, but you've got history there in the military, but also the care system, because he was orphaned at a young age, along with his brother Edward Tull, who went on to be Glasgow's first mixed race dentist as well. And then, so then you've got three things there, three institutions of sports, the military, and care that still today have issues when it comes to inequalities. And I think that's something that could be explored a bit more, because I think in the narrative of Walter Tull, we tend to focus on what's considered the good history, which is respectable history of military service, and to a degree sports as well. But I think within that story, there's a story about class that people could explore, because he has working class origins, on his dad being a black Barbadian immigrant, and his mum being white English from Kent. And his mum's side of the family were really poor as well, to the point that when his mum and dad died, that the family couldn't take the children in. So they were thinking about the workhouse. That's how poor they were. It was like a Charles Dickens novel, and I think that's a narrative we could also explore in that story of Walter Tull as well.
So the relationship for you between different forms of oppression, race, class, and not perhaps in the case so much of Walter Tull, but certainly in the case of his mother, probably gender, and the way these things intermix is something that's for you important to explore. So perhaps I could ask you a little. I mean, I'll come back in a minute to your activism, but I want to explore that element of how you describe yourself. Perhaps we could just explore for a second the intersectionality of race, gender, class, and indeed others, and how important it is for you looking at critical race theory as something that helps in understanding that intersectionality better.
I think we can't talk about race and racism outside of an intersectional framework. I find a lot of places who want to do anti-racist work want to do it as a single strain, as a single thread of thought. Because when you look at racism, it threadings alone, it comes with predominantly as well classism. It can come with transphobia and homophobia. It can come with ableism and so many more ways of discrimination attached to it that make those issues of racism more complex. It rarely comes by itself. And I think few people of colour will fit into one box of discrimination of just race. Because I know in Britain, if you are essentially not white, you're more likely to be working class. So then you've got two there of racism and classism. And then if you're a woman as well, then you've got sexism. And then if you're in a wheelchair, you've got ableism. So I think when we do discuss anti-racism as a concept, I'm not sure you can discuss it without taking all these other things into an account, but putting race at the center of it and sort of having like a flower around it of different forms of discrimination. And I think that's how you can start that conversation.
I mean, some Marxists would argue that if the center of the flower that you've just mentioned would be class, and that the other forms of oppression would form the petals around it. But you quite clearly said that you locate race at the center of the thing, which is what critical race theory does, of course.
Yeah.
And so how do you think that, how do you incorporate or relate anti-racist activity with issues around social class, around what might be the Marxist tradition, the traditional left position around social class and classism?
Yeah, I think I'd put race first because I think in my experience, I found putting class first displaces race a lot of the time. It stops people having the conversation about racism. It seems to be the fact that people can't entertain the idea that two can coexist at the same time. And in talking about classism, people just want to focus on classism as one single thread of thought. But yeah, I think it's quite, I wouldn't say naive to put class first, but it does speak to privilege, I think, to varying degrees, that you are able to put class first, as if everyone is the same, I think.
So it's not so much a theoretical centering of race in the flower as a tactical issue, I suppose, to force people who perhaps whose traditions have located class as the prime driver for change or explanation, to think about race and to relocate race as important as class in perhaps in specific circumstances of determining the level of oppression and injustice that people suffer from.
Yeah.
Is that a fair summary? I'm kind of.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. I mean, I'm part of the traditional left in political terms. I consider myself a Marxist, but I've in recent years been inspired by critical race theory to relocate and rethink notions of class within a race specific context. And also I find the insights of critical race theory in other respects really, really helpful. I find it, perhaps you'd like to comment on this, the recent statements by our wonderful equality officer in the government, Kemi Badenoch, who actually has called for the banning of critical race theory for not to be taught in schools. I was surprised to hear that it was taught in schools, but there you are. Perhaps she knows more than I do. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that, this attempt to ban critical race theory and also anti-capitalist stuff as well. The government's issued guidance to schools that they can't teach anything that's anti-capitalist, which I find also very interesting. But
I mean, I'm not sure you can be anti-racist and not question capitalism's role in racism. Economic racism exists, and then when you tie that into stuff like, look at the stuff that Extinction Rebellion are campaigning for in terms of the climate crisis, and when climate does eventually become a massive problem. It's not saying it's not already is, but I'm not sure institutions will take it seriously until it's like a world-ending event, essentially. And if you look at the places that will be most affected by that, it is going to hit Black and brown countries really hard. So the environmental racism, tied that to capitalist corporation companies dumping oil and that sort of thing. And yeah, it's I'm not sure you can be anti-racist and not be, to some varying degrees, question capitalism. Not saying capitalism needs to, I'm not saying outrightly that capitalism needs to go, but at the same time, I do wonder what a world would look like without capitalism. I'm interested what it would look like, what it would look like without capitalism. Because I don't think we've never seen it before. I don't think.
No. People assume that we've we've been through the socialist phase and it's bad. And but looking beyond capitalism, at some point we're going to look beyond capitalism, because it's not. Well, you've mentioned it. The climate crisis is going to be on us within the next 10, 20 years. The main victims of that are going to be the South, the Black nations, southern continents, and poor people in those countries. And there's going to be a huge refugee crisis, and we know what the reaction is going to be from the capitalist North to a flow of refugees to escape the catastrophe which they're facing. And capitalism really has no answers to those questions. Let's come back to your activism. You speak of yourself as an activist. In what sense are you a political or social activist?
Anyone that resists, I think, against established norms can call themselves to varying degrees an activist. It's not something that I originally labeled myself as. Other people seem to do that, because if something's wrong, I tend to say something about it. And if that's activism, then that's activism, isn't it? If I see something that's...
You seem to be, you don't like labels particularly, not simple labels anyway, being put into a box.
No, but activist, I think a lot of people that do, like, activism can look differently to different communities, different people, and activism is not always going out marching and protesting. I think it's challenging the status quo, and that can present differently in different places and in our institutions, or anyone that brings new ideas to a scenario that's been going sort of been the same for a while, and then you bring that new idea, and then you're labelled as a troublemaker, essentially. I think that's the activism that I've sort of found myself in. Specifically, like with education, for example, even just saying de-colonising the curriculum gets some people upset. So I think that...
Well, that's a success then. At least they're reacting to something and being forced to think about something. But perhaps you'd like to say something. You were involved with the Students' Union at the University of Northampton, and you're the ethnic minority officer there. Perhaps you'd like to say something about the work that you did while you were in that role at the university. When
I was in that role, I did a thread of events for Black History Month. So this is October 2019, and it was well received by students that came, and some members of staff. But it was the first of that kind that the university has sort of had ever really done. And the person that did that role before me, in a part-time position, did also do Black History Month, but it wasn't to that extent. But I know to the people that came, it was well appreciated, and the lecturers I got to come to speak as well were really, I really enjoyed it as well. But yeah, I did anti-racist events. I did events on de-colonising the curriculum. I did a poetry event. I did film nights. I did a 6-part lecture series as well. I think it was five or six lecturers came from around Northampton, not only Northamptonshire, but from London as well. We had University of Sunderland's Professor Donna Chambers came to speak about Black History Month. I think it was the first of its sort that the university had ever had. And I think people that did come to the events really appreciated it, because not just from a university point of view, but from a Northampton point of view, I think it was sort of unprecedented in that way.
There were, I mean, they've been well before your time, but there were events at the university on Black history. But many years ago, I mean, Julia Bush was an academic there who pioneered the Black History course
I heard about
at the university, and the Black History project she was very much involved in. And there were lectures and things, but then the university killed it all off effectively by making people redundant and what have you. So until your time, it had been off the agenda. And, and that's what's happened to so many things to do with race. And critical race theory, of course, explains this, that things come and go as issues. And now it's back on the agenda because of Black Lives Matters. You know, that's placed Black history and de-colonising back on the agenda again. And I know that you're very much part of that movement. So you'd like to say something about Black Lives Matters and your involvement there?
I agree with the slogan. The organisation, I have question marks about it, but the slogan in itself, I agree wholeheartedly with the slogan. It's so basic and it's so simple and easy to remember, and it says so many things. It's applicable to almost every facet of society in terms of racism and how Black lives are treated, from policing and education to healthcare. And the criminal justice system. Black lives are not valued, and they haven't been. They haven't been ever really. So I think Black Lives Matter it's important. I think for everyone to get on this, and I think also it's in this country. It's also still seen to some extent an American thing. When we're just as culpable, Britain are just as culpable in the same inequalities really that America has been criticised of, especially on things like policing and in education as well. So yeah, Black Lives Matter. Yeah, it's something I support.
I mean, you've referred to policing. I read. I mean, you were fortunate enough to feature in a Guardian newspaper feature on young British and Black back in July, and in that you referenced the stop and search as an issue for you, and for many other Black people as well. And you also referenced the Black Lives Matter protest in Northampton as being really that it really enthused you about re-enthused you about being that activist. Would you like to say something about the stop and search and that, how that thing with the Guardian arose, perhaps?
I've only ever been stopped and searched by a police officer once in my life. I know I'm one of the fortunate ones where it's not constant. I do know a lot of stop and searches happen to people that drive as well. Black people that drive cars are always being stopped. I don't drive, so I don't have to experience any of that. I was stopped when I was 14, so it was 10 years ago now, and it's never happened since. And with the Guardian article, I got approached with that through work I was doing in Buckinghamshire. So a couple of years ago, I'd worked on a play in Buckingham on Walter Tull with a theatre company called Now and Then Theatre, and I worked on the history in terms of Walter Tull on that play. And then recently, I got added to a Facebook group called Black Lives Matter Buckingham, and I've just been posting stuff in there. And I basically, one of the leaders asked me if I wanted to be interviewed by the Guardian, essentially, on this Black Lives Matter stuff. And yeah, I said yeah to do it, and now I'm now an admin of that group.
You're also famous, which is really great.
Oh, everyone says I'm famous.
But of course, you wrote a recent article, I think, a blog about Marcus Rashford receiving his MBE, So even if you become famous, I understand that you might have some doubt about accepting such an award.
Yeah, I'm a bit funny about stuff like that. Marcus Rashford's what he's achieved is, I think it's really good. But I also think it's indicative that it's a failure of government as well, that he had to do that. And I also think in that fact that exists also shows that the welfare state has failed as well. So yeah,
This is in a sense a classic equalities issue, but not to do with race directly.
No,
but for all poor people and people that are oppressed by poverty.
Yeah.
And Marcus Rashford has picked up on that and done a huge amount of work to raise that as an issue. And lots of people, kids in particular, have benefited from that in recent weeks.
I mean, kids will benefit, but the community has come out to help him as well, which is really good. But I don't think it's sustainable as well. It's a short-term solution to a problem that's systemic and long-term. And the fact that they gave him an MBE for that, I just find it as it's an insult. It's insulting, really. I'm not sure you should get British Empire medals for equalities stuff, because
there's some concern about the language of this. You know, the British Empire medal is a bit problematic, I think, for many. And perhaps we need to have an award which has a totally different perspective rather than something that appears to glorify the British Empire. Yeah,
I mean, I think British Empire, having done reading around it as well, like it's not just land grabs and enslavement, it's sort of like the colonization of the mind as well. And when you look at education, and somewhere like India, for example, 1830s, there was a chap called Thomas Macaulay in 1830s India that basically argued that Western knowledge was superior to that of indigenous Indian knowledge, and basically said that everything had to be taught in English at that time. And that wasn't just in India, it happened in quite a few colonized countries where I think the term is called epistemic violence, where it's violence by knowledge, and how indigenous knowledge production was replaced with that of Western, or in this case, English knowledge. And that is as much violence as it is as the slave trade was. Because then you've got whole peoples that don't know themselves, don't know their cultures, their histories, their languages, and their traditions, and that's colonization as well at its core. And I think focusing on the violent stuff, is the physical violent stuff, is easy because it's evident and it's more you can see it and it's obvious. But then you look at the more intellectual violence that happened, and it still happens in academia as well.
I mean, that's very much part of the redemption song, isn't it? Bob Marley, free yourself from mental slavery, and the work of Frantz Fanon in terms of was it Black Skin, White Mask, and his critique of colonialism that was in North Africa, I believe. But I mean, the way in which the Western world has dominated thought and suppressed others is something that we should be deeply ashamed of historically.
I mean, my undergrad degree was in creative writing. I did a lot of English modules in that. Did quite a few, worked with quite a lot of books on canon, literary canon, and look at the knowledge-based violence that's within that, and how those sorts of texts describe people of African heritage, or the racial other, essentially, and why are those texts canon, and because you don't need, people didn't question those texts. They were seen as intellectually beyond critique, essentially. So when you've got books like Jane Eyre, for example, where you've got the character of Bertha in Jane Eyre, who was a white Creole woman, and she's seen as a representative of the West Indies, and like everything she does is a problem, essentially. It's hellish and chaotic, and that sort of language and rhetoric around her, whilst Jane is opposite to that and is representative of England, and you have a lot of texts like that depict that through the racial other. But Bertha is a white Creole woman, but she would not be seen as white if in England, because while she is a white person, her language was that of the West Indies, in terms of how she spoke and whatnot, which sort of that's a clash of cultures, possibly a caste and class there as well.
Is that the same as the way in which some portraits from, say, the 17th, 18th century, which depict white women, very often aristocratic women, with their black slave, all dressed in their finery? It was a way in which the whiteness and the superiority of the white woman was being offset against this notion of the foreign other, who was treated like as a slave and as an animal almost. It's the way people might dress up dogs today. It's that offsetting of whiteness and superiority against this blackness.
Possibly, but Bertha is white, but she's not doesn't fit the conventions of whiteness.
Would that be a class thing, perhaps?
Yeah.
She's not of the same class status as Jane Eyre. She's somebody who's a Creole, who would have been an indentured worker, probably historically in the Caribbean.
I mean, she's described as like just a crazy lady. She's like sort of separate from everyone else, isolated. Her mother is described as a mad woman as well, a mad Creole woman, and those sorts of descriptions around her, tying that to the West Indies. And then other texts like, say, let's take something like Heart of Darkness, for example.
Conrad.
Joseph Conrad. I know the Nigerian author Chinua Achebe called him a bloody racist, and then wrote that essay against scathing Heart of Darkness. And even just the title Heart of Darkness about Africa in itself it just tells you everything you need to know before you even read the book. You know what this book is going to be like, and what it's going to be about. Is describing Africa as just dark, and Africa was called the Dark Continent as well. So yeah, those sorts of texts, they, in relation to violence and violence via knowledge, those authors were seen as intellectually the best. So when you have these authors perpetuating these views, people didn't question them, and now you've got people now wanting to decolonize the curriculum and challenging these authors, challenging the canon, essentially. And it's getting people a bit upset, because now you're getting people challenging the Brontes, for example, even though I don't like
classic English writers, if you like. It's a bit like the recent. I was on a debate recently organised by Churchill College, Cambridge, about the legacy of Winston Churchill, and it was really fascinating, given this was organised by the college, which was set up in his name, and this rethinking of historic figures and the canons of English literature and poetry and what is something part of what the challenge of Black Lives Matters and the anti-racist movement is about today, I think. Yeah,
I mean, I don't want to get rid of the canon. Like,
no,
I quite enjoy reading a lot of those books. I loved Wuthering Heights at school, and I think those books have still got a lot of things to learn from, and that can teach people, or that people can learn from and be taught about. But I think in decolonising the curriculum, there are other books that could be used as sort of companion books to those sorts of texts. So when you're
but also they help to illustrate the way in which racism can infect, if you like. I don't like medical metaphors really, but it can infect even some great books and great writers and great thinkers. That racism was so endemic that it was common sense. It wasn't questioned, but now we can question it, and this critique can enable us to critique racism today. Could I perhaps ask you a little bit about your poetry, and because you also described yourself as a poet? What's the well, say something about why poetry is important to you. Why do you consider yourself a poet?
I just think it's a really great way of expressing how you feel about things, without having to write long essays.
Or a book or something.
Yeah, but poetry is like, it's saying as much as you can with as little as you can, I think. And I think a lot of people would benefit from it.
So it's kind of literature for the lazy.
Yeah, kind of a little bit. But at the same time, I think there is a blanket view of what poetry is, and isn't, again, perpetuated by the canon and academia. And spoken word poetry, for example, I was not taught on my degree because it was viewed as intellectually inferior to print page poetry like Wordsworth and Shakespeare.
So dub poetry wouldn't have been taught?
No. But yeah, I think poetry, it's what you make it. It's what you make of it, really, I think. And I'm not sure you can put a definition on it either, much to contrary belief.
I'm going to wind up now. Thank you very much. But I'd like, before we finally finish, I'd like to ask you to say something about your Can You Poet event. You've got an event coming up on November the 28th. But what's the what is Can You Poet? What's behind this event? Because you've held other ones in the past as well. Yeah,
Can You Poet is an event, as a spoken word poetry event that I started when I was an undergrad student, in order to get poets to talk about social and political issues that are important to them. And on each event, I put a vague theme on it, and it basically gets people to explore politics and society and those social issues, and have conversations that we're not always comfortable having in open forums. So I've done a number of events since I started that. The last event we did was on decolonisation, and did one on the Windrush in June, and this next one is on race and poverty, in collaboration with the Hope Centre in Northampton and Northamptonshire Rights Anti-Equality Council, where we have the poets speaking, but there's also going to be a guest talk by Sarah Edwards from Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, talking about poverty and race from the perspective of the criminal justice system, which should be really interesting. So that's to look forward to.
November the 28th.
Yeah.
At 5:30, I think, and it's a Zoom event. Normally, obviously, in the past, your events would have been live events. Real, in a sense, real face-to-face events, but now they're having to be done by Zoom. So it's a Zoom event, 28th of November, 5:30. And how do people register for it? Is there, if they Google, I suppose if they Google or look on Facebook, Can You Poet? They'll find reference to it.
Can You Poet, NN Austere, I think I called it. So you should find it on Facebook, I think. And it's on my website as well, which is treventour.com. So you should be able to find the information.
TREVENTORU.com.
TREVENTOUR.com. Yeah.
Well, Tre, that brings us nicely to the end. I'd really like to thank you for putting up with me for nearly 3/4 of an hour, or nearly, it was over 3/4 of an hour. But it's been really great, and hopefully I catch you later at a Northamptonshire REC event, or even the Can You Poet event on the 28th. Yeah. So really, thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you. See you.